The thing about deep space archaeology is that everyone thinks they're the smartest being in the room, especially when the room is a 5,000-year-old derelict station floating in the ass end of nowhere, held together by spite and questionable structural integrity. The Valorian Reach had been a mystery for exactly 3 centuries, ever since a mining expedition stumbled across it while strip mining an asteroid belt that definitely belonged to someone else. Nobody knew who built it. Nobody knew what it was for. And absolutely nobody could read the symbols covering every available surface, like some obsessive ancient species had gotten drunk on marking pens and decided to redecorate. Which naturally meant that every academic with a dissertation to defend and an ego the size of a small moon wanted a piece of it. The research vessel Academic Excellence, a name that should have been a war crime, hung in space 300 meters from the station's docking port. Inside its cramped conference room, 17 of the galaxy's most decorated scholars were doing what decorated scholars do best: arguing with each other while drinking terrible coffee and pretending their credentials meant something. Dr. Kelvin Thrace leaned against the back wall, watching the circus with the resigned expression of someone who'd made several poor life choices and was currently living through all of them simultaneously. He was human, which meant he was automatically the least credentialed person in the room despite holding 3 doctorates and publishing more papers than some of these windbags had read. Humans were the new kids on the galactic block, having achieved faster than light travel only 90 years ago, and the established academic community treated them with all the respect usually reserved for particularly slow children who'd wandered into a university lecture. The station beyond the viewport was a monster, roughly cylindrical, maybe 8 kilometers long and 2 wide, covered in the kind of architectural brutalism that suggested its builders had strong opinions about right angles and absolutely no interest in aesthetic appeal. It was pockmarked with impact craters, scorched by weapons fire that predated most current civilizations, and absolutely covered in those symbols. They ran in bands around the hull, spiraled down support struts, framed every doorway and viewport. Thousands upon thousands of symbols, each about a meter tall, carved or etched or somehow burned into the metal with a precision that made modern manufacturing look sloppy. And nobody, in 300 years of study, had the faintest idea what they meant. Professor Xylith was holding court at the moment, all 7 of her crystalline limbs gesticulating wildly as she explained her theory for the 9th time that week. She was Quiridian, a species that looked like someone had convinced diamonds to become sentient and immediately regret it. Her voice had the pleasant quality of breaking glass, set to a rhythm section. The electromagnetic signature patterns are irrefutable, she announced, projecting a hologram that looked like a headache having an existential crisis. These symbols are clearly a form of quantum data storage, encoding information in the molecular structure of the station itself. My analysis indicates at least 17 dimensions of information density. Your analysis, croaked Professor Balm from across the table, indicates that you failed basic physics. Balm was Mytharian, which meant he was essentially a very opinionated cloud of gas contained in a mobility suit. His species communicated through chemical signals, which the translator rendered as the voice of a chain-smoking philosophy professor who'd given up on everything except being right. These are obviously religious iconography. The repetitive patterns, the positioning at key structural points, the way they frame entryways, it's textbook temple architecture. I've seen this exact pattern on 47 different worlds. You've seen rectangles on 47 different worlds. Cut in Professor Zixthar, their telepathic voice bypassing everyone's ears and arriving directly in their brains, with all the subtlety of a brick through a window. Zixthar was Velen, a species that looked vaguely octopoid if octopi had been designed by committee and nobody could agree on how many tentacles were appropriate. These symbols represent dimensional coordinates. The vertical variations indicate spatial positioning. The horizontal sequences represent temporal data. This station isn't a temple or a database, it's a map. The argument devolved from there, as it had every day for the past 3 weeks. 17 brilliant minds, collectively responsible for thousands of published papers, dozens of major discoveries, and enough academic awards to collapse a decent-sized bookshelf, and they couldn't agree on whether to have lunch at noon or 12:30. Kelvin sipped his coffee, which tasted like someone had filtered it through an old boot, and watched the station through the viewport. There was something almost hypnotic about those symbols, the way they marched in perfect rows around the hull. He'd spent hours staring at them through telescopes, through analysis software, through every scanning technology the ship possessed. And yeah, he'd noticed something. Something kind of obvious, actually. But bringing it up seemed like a great way to get laughed out of the room by people whose opinion of human intelligence ranked somewhere between amusing and let them try. Clearly, we need to establish a base of operations within the station itself, Xylith was saying, having moved past her quantum theory to practical matters. The external analysis has been fascinating but ultimately insufficient. We need to access the interior chambers, establish what the builders used this facility for, and work backward from there. This, at least, everyone could agree on. Which was how, 6 hours later, Kelvin found himself in an environment suit that smelled like the previous owner had strong feelings about personal hygiene. And all of them were negative, floating through the docking port of a station that had been dead longer than human civilization had been literate. The interior was exactly as welcoming as the exterior suggested it would be. Dark, cold, and covered in more of those damned symbols. They were everywhere. Floors, walls, ceilings, around doorways. Next to what might have been control panels, or might have been avant-garde art installations. The research team spread out through the main corridor, scanners humming, lights cutting through the darkness like accusations. Remarkable preservation. Someone muttered over the comm. Minimal oxidation, no biological contamination. Whatever happened here, it happened fast. They found the chamber on the second day. It was huge, easily 50 meters across and 30 high, with a domed ceiling that made Kelvin's architectural sense twitch uncomfortably. And it was absolutely plastered with symbols, not just covered, not just decorated, but completely overwhelmed with them. They spiraled up the walls in sequences, marched across the floor in geometric patterns, radiated from a central point on the ceiling like someone had detonated an alphabet bomb. And right in the center of it all, on a raised platform that suggested importance or at least a flair for drama, was a control panel. Definitely a control panel this time, with what looked like input surfaces and display screens, all dormant, all covered in dust that had been settling for longer than most species had been spacefaring. The scholars went absolutely feral. Within minutes, the chamber was a chaos of scanning equipment, sample collectors, and academics jockeying for position like it was the last lifeboat off the Titanic. Xylith immediately claimed the ceiling patterns, spreading across them like crystal ivy, while making pronouncements about quantum foam. Buln drifted to the floor symbols, his suit's sensors working overtime. Zixthar positioned themselves at the control panel, tentacles hovering over surfaces they dared not touch. Kelvin found himself shunted to a corner with the other junior researchers, which was fine. He'd learned early that trying to compete with established academics was like trying to win an argument with a black hole. Instead, he turned his attention to the wall behind him, where the symbols ran in neat, organized rows. And that's when he saw it. It took a minute. The symbols were complex, sure, lots of curves and angles, the kind of thing that looked profound and meaningful. But there was a pattern, not an electromagnetic pattern or a religious sequence or dimensional coordinates, just a pattern. A simple, obvious, staring you in the face pattern. The symbols repeated in a sequence, first symbol, second symbol, third symbol, continuing up to what looked like 10 distinct characters. Then they started over, sometimes in ascending order, sometimes descending, sometimes in groups that added up in ways that made Kelvin's math-oriented brain start connecting dots. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," he muttered. Over by the control panel, Xylith was building to a crescendo. The complexity here suggests a civilization operating on principles beyond our current understanding. These aren't mere symbols, they're keys. Multidimensional encryption protecting knowledge we can barely conceptualize. Or instructions for a cargo cult, Buln countered. Ritual procedures meant to invoke divine intervention. The repetition, the careful placement, it's liturgical. It's navigational data, Zixthar insisted, their mental voice somehow managing to sound condescending even directly in people's brains. Spatial coordinates locked in a temporal matrix. This station was a waypoint for travelers moving through dimensions we don't fully understand. Kelvin cleared his throat. Nobody noticed. He tried again, louder. One junior researcher glanced his way, then went back to cataloging dust samples. "Excuse me," he said, still quiet, still polite, still ignored. The argument was heating up. Xylith had deployed holographic models. Buln was citing ancient texts. Zixthar was doing the telepathic equivalent of speaking in italics. 3 other professors had joined in, each absolutely certain that their interpretation was correct, and everyone else was working from flawed assumptions. "These are numbers," Kelvin said, not particularly loud, not particularly emphatic. The chamber went quiet, not a thoughtful quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when someone said something so stupid that everyone needs a moment to process it. Professor Zixthar turned to face him, tentacles quivering with what might have been amusement. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "They're numbers," Kelvin said, warming to the topic despite the 17 pairs of eyes and various sensory organs now locked onto him. "These symbols, their accounting system, base 10, looks like, the sequence repeats in mathematical progressions. This row here, it's going 1 through 10. This one's counting by 2s. This one's descending from what looks like a large number." The silence somehow got more profound. Then Professor Xylith laughed. It sounded like wind chimes being murdered. "Numbers. You think these complex symbolic structures, encoded into a station of unknown origin and purpose, are simply numbers?" "Yes?" Kelvin said, though it came out more like a question than he'd intended. "My dear human," Buln said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining complex topics to houseplants. "We've been studying these symbols for 3 centuries. The greatest minds in the galaxy have analyzed them from every conceivable angle. If they were something as mundane as a counting system, don't you think we would have noticed?" "I mean," Kelvin said, "apparently not." Professor Zixthar floated closer, their mental voice taking on a teaching tone that made Kelvin's teeth itch. "Let me explain why you're incorrect. First, the symbolic complexity far exceeds that of any known numerical system. Second, the placement patterns don't correspond to mathematical sequences. Third, the electromagnetic readings Xylith mentioned indicate quantum-level encoding. Fourth, the cultural context Buln identified suggests ritualistic purpose. And fifth, my own analysis of the dimensional properties indicates spatial-temporal mapping that simple numbers could never achieve." "Right," Kelvin said slowly. "But what if I could show you the mathematical progression?" "By all means," Xylith said, and 17 academics settled in to watch the human embarrass himself, which was apparently the afternoon's entertainment. Kelvin pulled up his datapad, projecting a hologram of the wall symbols he'd been studying. "Okay, so these 10 symbols. Let's assign them values 0 through 9, just provisionally. Now watch this sequence here." He highlighted a row running horizontally across the wall. "If these are what I think they are, this is counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Then this combination means 10, then 10 and 1, 10 and 2, continuing up." "That's a massive assumption," Buln said. "You're projecting human mathematical concepts onto an alien system." "Sure," Kelvin agreed. "But look at this sequence. It's going 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's countdown order, and here, these are going by even numbers. 2, 4, 6, 8. And this group, this is multiplication tables. 1 times 1, 1 times 2, 1 times 3. Continuing up. The pattern repeats over and over." "Coincidence," Xylith said firmly. "Pattern-seeking behavior in insufficient data. Humans are notorious for finding patterns that don't exist." "Okay, but then? Explain this." Kelvin highlighted a section near the control panel. This sequence here. If these are numbers, this is counting down from 1000. 999, 998, 997. It's decreasing by 1 each time. And it's positioned right next to what looks like a primary system control. The scholars exchanged glances. The kind of glances that suggested they were about to explain, slowly and clearly, why the human was wrong and should probably go back to taking notes while the adults worked. The probability of random symbols forming mathematical sequences, Professor Zixthar began, is actually quite high when you consider. Then what's that? Kelvin pointed to the control panel, where a display surface had suddenly flickered to life. Everyone froze. The panel, dormant for thousands of years, was showing symbols, the same symbols from the walls. And they were changing. Slowly, methodically, in a descending sequence. 995, 994, 993. Oh, said Professor Buln in a very small voice. Oh no. That's a countdown, Kelvin said, and he really didn't mean for it to sound like "I told you so," but it absolutely came out that way. That's a countdown, and based on the rate it's decreasing, we have about 16 minutes. 16 minutes until what? Xylith demanded, but her voice had lost its condescending edge and gained a hint of something that might have been panic. No idea, Kelvin admitted. But generally, when you find a countdown on a derelict station that's been dead for thousands of years and suddenly starts working when you show up, it's not counting down to something good. The chamber erupted into chaos. Scanners deployed, sensors activated, everyone trying to figure out what the countdown meant while simultaneously insisting that it couldn't possibly be what it obviously was. The numbers kept ticking down with mechanical precision. 937, 936. 935. We need to shut it down. Someone shouted. We don't know what it controls, someone else countered. We need to evacuate. A third voice suggested, and that was starting to sound like the smart option. Kelvin was already moving, running his hands over the wall symbols with new understanding. If these were numbers, really numbers, then the rest of the symbols made a different kind of sense. These weren't mystical encryptions or religious texts. They were labels, instructions, warnings. Hey, he called out, but nobody was listening. Hey, these other symbols, they're not numbers. They're 872, 871, 870. The station groaned, not metaphorically. Literally groaned, a deep metallic sound that resonated through the deck plates and into everyone's bones. Lights that had been dark for millennia flickered on, painting the chamber in harsh yellow illumination. And somewhere, distant but getting closer, something was humming. Building. Charging. Everyone out, Professor Zixthar commanded, and for once nobody argued. The scholars scrambled for the exit, abandoning equipment and dignity in equal measure. Kelvin grabbed his datapad and ran, but his brain was still working, still processing what he'd seen. The symbols weren't just numbers. They were numbers and labels, distance markers, warning signs, operational instructions. The kind of thing you'd put on a station to help people navigate it, to keep it running, to tell them when something was wrong. They hit the docking port running, tumbling through in a mass of environment suits and academic panic. The ship's pilot, bless her, had the engines already spooling when they arrived. Go, Xylith shouted, unnecessary since they were already going. Go, go, go. The academic excellence pulled away from the station with all the grace of a startled elephant, engines screaming. Through the viewport, Kelvin watched the Valorian reach, 300 years of mystery and speculation, sitting in space like a judgment. 758. 757. 756. What's it counting down to? Someone asked, voice tight. Best guess. Kelvin said. Core meltdown. Reactor failure. Some kind of self-destruct mechanism triggered when we activated the control panel. That's ridiculous, Buln said, but his heart wasn't in it. Why would they build that? Same reason we build it, Kelvin replied. Safety mechanism. Prevent unauthorized access. Keep dangerous technology from falling into the wrong hands. Pick your reason. 523. 522. 521. The station was definitely warming up now. Kelvin's scanner was picking up energy readings that made no physical sense, power outputs that should have been impossible from a dormant reactor. Whatever was happening in there, it was building to something big. We should be recording this, Xylith said weakly. For the research. We're recording your potential last words, the pilot said. How's that for research? 379. 378. 377. Kelvin turned his attention back to his datapad, pulling up the images he'd captured before they fled. The wall symbols, thousands of them, all making a new kind of sense. He started cataloging, translating, his brain making connections that 3 centuries of scholarship had somehow missed. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," he said again, but this time with more feeling. "What?" Professor Zixthar demanded. "What did you find?" "These symbols next to the numbers," Kelvin said slowly. "They're not mystical encryption. They're directional markers. Docking bay. Fuel storage. Maintenance access. Life support. Emergency exit. It's signage. This whole station is covered in warning signs and directional markers. 205, 204, 203. That's impossible, Xylith said. We've been studying this station for 300 years. You're telling me it's just been covered in the equivalent of exit signs the entire time. Exit signs in a language nobody bothered to learn, Kelvin corrected. Because everyone was too busy, assuming it had to be something profound. The scholars stared at him. Then at the station. Then at each other. The kind of stares that suggested several career retrospectives were happening in real time. 138. 137. 136. So what was its purpose? Buln asked quietly. If it's just covered in maintenance instructions and warning signs, what was this place for? Kelvin pulled up another image, enhanced it, stared at a symbol he'd seen repeated dozens of times near what they'd assumed were major structural points, next to what he now recognized as the descending numbers counting distance. I think, he said slowly, and I really hate that I'm right about this, but I think it was a rest stop. Silence. The kind of silence that suggested everyone was trying very hard to pretend they hadn't heard what they'd just heard. A rest stop, Professor Zixthar repeated, their mental voice somehow conveying the exact timbre of someone's soul leaving their body. Yeah, Kelvin said, warming to the theory despite the rapidly approaching apocalypse. Look at the layout. Docking bays for multiple ship sizes, what we thought was a temple, probably a refueling station. Those chambers we couldn't identify, habitation modules, rest areas. The symbols are showing distances to various amenities. Fuel, 500 meters. Food services, 1,200 meters. Waste disposal, 300 meters. It's a truck stop, an ancient, massive, deeply over-engineered truck stop, but still fundamentally a place for travelers to stop and refuel. 75. 74. 73. 300 years, Xylith said quietly. 300 years of study. Thousands of papers. Dozens of careers built on analyzing this station. And it's a truck stop. A truck stop with a really aggressive self-destruct mechanism for intruders, Kelvin added helpfully. Probably explains why it's in this condition. Someone didn't pay the fuel bill. Station went into lockdown. Anyone who tried to break in afterward got the countdown treatment. 42. 41. 40. The quantum signatures I detected, Xylith continued, sounding like she was working through grief in real time. The electromagnetic patterns. Probably the power distribution system, Kelvin suggested. These places needed a lot of juice to run everything. The religious symbolism, Buln added. The ritual placement. Fire exits, Kelvin said. Safety regulations. You put those in specific places. Code requirements. The dimensional mapping. Zixthar finished. The spatial temporal coordinates. Navigation markers, Kelvin said. Distances to other stations. Jump point coordinates. The kind of thing you'd want if you're traveling through unfamiliar space. 20, 19, 18. We need to be farther away, the pilot announced. Way farther away. She wasn't wrong. The station was glowing now, visible light radiation washing across its hull. The countdown continued with mechanical indifference. 15, 14, 13. For what it's worth, Kelvin said, watching 300 years of academic certainty about to go up in flames. It was a really nice truck stop. Excellent construction. Solid safety systems. 5 stars, would stop for space coffee again. 12, 11, 10. The scholars watched in silence as the station that had defined their careers reached its final moments. Kelvin felt a little bad about it, honestly. 300 years of study, thousands of brilliant minds, all trying to unlock the mysteries of the universe, and the answer had been bathroom this way, fuel that way. Please dispose of waste in designated containers. 9, 8, 7. I think, Professor Zixtar said quietly, that this stays between us. Absolutely. Buln agreed. Immediately. No question, Xylith added. 6, 5, 4. We can reframe this, someone suggested. The symbology represents a fascinating linguistic evolution of utilitarian communication structures. Perfect, someone else agreed. Very publishable. 3, 2, 1. The Valorian Reach detonated. Not exploded, detonated, like someone had set off a precisely calculated demolition charge designed to remove all evidence of a structure's existence. The reaction was clean, controlled, and absolutely comprehensive. One moment, 8 kilometers of ancient mystery. The next moment, rapidly expanding debris field and a lot of very quiet academics. Well, Kelvin said into the silence, at least we evacuated. Nobody responded. They were too busy watching their careers flash before their eyes, or whatever passed for eyes in their respective species. 300 years of research, multiple academic disciplines, hundreds of published papers, all based on the fundamental assumption that the Valorian Reach was something profound and meaningful. And it had been a truck stop, with really, really good signage. The data we collected will still be valuable, Xylith said eventually, trying for optimistic and landing somewhere around desperate. We learned about construction techniques, material sciences. Whoever built this had impressive engineering capabilities. They built a rest stop that lasted 5,000 years, Kelvin agreed. That's pretty impressive. Ever see what happens to a highway rest stop after 30 years? This is significantly better. Perhaps we could publish on the linguistic aspects, Buln suggested. The evolution of numerical systems across civilizations. Or the cultural importance of way stations in ancient trading networks, Zixtar added. The anthropological implications. Or, Kelvin said carefully, we could publish on the dangers of academic bias. How preconceptions can blind us to simple explanations. The importance of considering mundane possibilities before jumping to exotic theories. The silence suggested that this was not, in fact, what they were going to publish. Or we could go with the linguistic evolution thing, Kelvin amended quickly. That's good too. The academic excellence turned away from the debris field, engines humming as it prepared for the jump back to civilized space. In the conference room, 17 of the galaxy's greatest minds sat in contemplative silence, each processing the day's revelations in their own way. Professor Xylith was already drafting a paper about quantum-enabled numerical systems and their applications in space-based architecture. Professor Buln was outlining research into the spiritual significance of mathematical order in ancient cultures. Professor Zixtar was calculating how to spin dimensional navigation markers into something that sounded suitably profound. And Kelvin sat in the back, datapad open, translating the rest of the symbols he'd captured. Directional signs, safety warnings, maintenance schedules, operating instructions for vending machines. A surprisingly detailed complaint system for travelers unhappy with the service. All in numbers and simple pictographic language that any species could understand, assuming they bothered to look for the simple answer instead of assuming everything had to be complex. You know, he said to no one in particular, there's probably dozens of these stations out there. Maybe hundreds. Ancient highway system, connecting trade routes across the galaxy. all covered in helpful signs telling you where to go and what to do, and we've been treating every single one like it's the Rosetta Stone. Nobody answered. They were too busy salvaging their academic reputations. Kelvin smiled, saved his translations, and settled in for the journey home. Somewhere out there, some ancient species had built a network of rest stops so well designed, so perfectly engineered, that they'd lasted thousands of years beyond their creators. Had marked them so clearly that anyone should have been able to read them, if they'd just looked for the obvious answer. And humanity, stumbling into a galactic community that had been studying these stations for centuries without understanding them, had taken one look and said, "Oh, those are numbers." Sometimes, Kelvin reflected, being the new kid in class had advantages. You hadn't yet learned all the complicated theories. You hadn't invested years in elaborate explanations. You could look at something covered in counting symbols and think those are probably numbers without worrying about how embarrassing that would be if you were wrong. The academic excellence jumped to faster than light, leaving the debris field behind. Somewhere in the wreckage, pieces of carefully maintained signage drifted through space, still readable, still clear, still trying to tell anyone who'd listen exactly what they were and what they meant. But nobody was listening anymore. They were too busy writing papers about quantum linguistics and dimensional spirituality, building new theories on top of the ashes of the old ones, absolutely certain that this time they'd figured it out. And in the back of the ship, a human researcher sat with a datapad full of translations, a small smile, and the certain knowledge that the galaxy was full of wonders. Most of them were just labeled better than anyone wanted to admit. The greatest mystery of the Valorian Reach, it turned out, was how 17 brilliant minds had managed to miss something so obvious for so long. But that was academic research for you. Sometimes the simplest answer was hiding behind walls of complexity built by people too invested in being right to consider that they might be wrong. Kelvin made a note to check other mysterious ancient sites for similar numbering systems. Wouldn't it be funny, he thought, if half the unsolved archaeological mysteries in the galaxy turned out to be truck stops, warehouses, and shopping centers, all clearly labeled and just waiting for someone to actually read the signs? 300 years of scholarship, ended by one human with a basic understanding of math and a willingness to state the obvious. The stars streaked past the viewport, and somewhere out there, the universe kept its secrets. But maybe, just maybe, some of those secrets were printed right on the surface, in numbers and symbols, waiting for someone to stop theorizing long enough to actually read them. Simple answers to simple questions, hiding in plain sight, while everyone looked for complexity that wasn't there. That, Kelvin decided, was the most human thing he'd encountered all week. And also, apparently, the most necessary. The galaxy needed more truck stops, and significantly more humans willing to point at the signs and say, "Hey, those are numbers." He settled back in his seat, datapad humming, already planning his paper. Numerical systems in ancient galactic infrastructure, a case study in obvious solutions, everyone somehow missed. It was going to be a bestseller, or get him laughed out of academia. But after today, he was pretty sure he could live with either option.